Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's part 2 of our gel play mixed media mechanics class. We have just raced through acrylics. We are now going to race through even faster some other products. I really want to highlight that a lot of what I'm going to show you with one of these products like paint, even though I'm not going to show it to you with these other substances, you can do them as well. So I'm trying to mix technique with product, but cross them all because most of them will work perfectly well with all the others. Let's get to demoing. And we are moving on to dye sprays. I am a fool for dye sprays. I just love a spray. I can't get enough of a spray. And when I discovered that dye sprays work magic on the gel plate, I was hooked. So you probably can use any spray ink for this. It's going to be a little different. If it's a pigment ink, it's going to be permanent. If it's a dye ink, it's not permanent. There's all those little factors. But one of the things to be aware of is that if you have different products, try them. Just see. So I'm going to show you just different ways that I use my dye sprays for pulling prints. So sometimes I just like to make a simple background. I will tell you in advance that the dye sprays are translucent. Dye ink is usually translucent. So be aware that you probably want to do it on a lighter background, because if you do it on a black background, you're not going to really see the pull. So I'm just using some collage paper that is pretty thin, so I can tear these up to make collage. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do something that I love to do because it gives me some choices for the collage paper. I just often get 3 because 3 is a magic number in art. And the ones I'm using are not metallic, so at least my brand, you don't need to shake them up. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to spritz, kind of make that triple line. I want you to notice that there's some pooling there, and it's kind of a little softer there. You get totally different effects depending upon whether it pools or not. So I'm using 3 colors here, and they are going to overlap a little bit. And I think I'm going to go and I'm going to bring one of the colors in there. Yeah. And now I'm just going to pull. So I'm just using, this sort of faux dictionary page collage-y thing. And let's just see what happens. I'm going to seep through because it's pretty thin paper, which is pretty cool. I'm going to pull it up, and I got that. Kind of heavy on the coffee flavor color, but you can definitely see the difference. And this is going to dry. This is such a easy, simple technique just to get a full-on background. Now, what I'm going to do is I have some stuff left there, and that's going to stay wet quite long. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to find, let's find one of these that already has something on it. And I'm just going to go ahead and I could do it 2 ways. I could lay it down and burnish it, or I could just kind of do sections. There's not much here, but I'm getting a little bit. And so you can see it mostly right there. I just get that random bleed. And because it's translucent, it doesn't cover up what you've done. So that was like a ghost pull in a manner of speaking, but I often do that as my main pull. So I'm going to still use that. I'm going to choose some colors. I'm going to use some of that color because it's already in there. And then let's go also a little darker. We'll use the coffee. And I'm going to show you what I often do. I don't want, for the moment, a heavy effect. So I am going to take the dye spray. I'm going to hold it really high, basically an arm's length. And I'm just going to spritz so it sprinkles down like a dewy rain in May. It's just going to, there's little spots here and there. And then I'm going to do the same thing with another color. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just pull the print. And I don't know if you can see the difference, but I definitely can. It adds a very painterly layer because it's just really soft and uneven. And usually what I do is I take my brayer and I brayer over it. It changes it a little bit. Now, to show you what that looks like more clearly, I'm going to do it on some white paper. I'm going to change colors. So I'm going to use that. And I'm going to sort of spritz it down so it just softly hits. And I'll use another color. And do the same thing. So that when I pull, I get that. It's just a soft addition of a layer that doesn't take away, but really enhances what's underneath it. Let's see if I have another light. Yeah. Let me go and start making some mess of that. You can see it just picks it up right there. I have a little control. Now, let's just say I didn't want it as spray-y and misty and soft. I'm just going to hold it much closer when I spray. So here I am, I don't know, what is this, about 6 inches? And then maybe I'll even go in this corner. I'm about 1.5 inches. So I get that flood. And always, let's do more than one color. It's going to be more interesting. And now I can either lay it down or I can pick it up in a pool. You obviously see when it's heavy like that, it's a very different effect. And then what I do is I get my brayer. So I want you to see it, what it looks like now, kind of pooling. And then I get my brayer and I roll it out. So if you rewind, you'll remember this was a pretty even coating from the layer of paint and the stencil. And now it's got just that really interesting variability to it. Just so quickly. I got all this good stuff right here. So we're certainly not going to waste that. We're going to pull it up. And I just find this so much more interesting. And I also get that really organic feel. So with every layer that I do that, I'm not obliterating what's underneath, but I'm adding depth and shade and shadow and shape. I'm liking this even more. I'm also noticing, of course, because sprays are a mess, and I'm not one to spray in a box. I mean, it's everywhere. It's on my computer, it's on my doc cam, it's on everything, but it's also on this paper that I have. So that is definitely going to be like, look at that right there. That's so much fun. That's definitely going to be cut up and used as collage after. All right, so I want to show you another thing with sprays. And I want to really, really highlight that I've used my brayer. And because I've used my brayer, you can see my brayer has all those beautiful spray spots. If I do not clean my brayer now, that means that when I roll it out, my next layer of paint, it's going to seep that color. I'm often fine with that, but if I know I'm going to say use white and I want to pull a print, this is a problem. And be aware that there's still all this dried up dye spray on my gel plate. That's also going to pull. So if you want it to be pristine with your next layer, you got to clean your gel plate. Am I going to clean mine? No, not at all. All right, so I am going to go ahead. I'm going to use the heavy cream, and I'm going to put a layer of heavy cream right on here. And what you're going to see is that dye spray that's on the plate and that's on the brayer is actually going to leach into the heavy cream, and it's going to give some color shifts. And I really like that. You know, I love the random mixing that happens when you're not trying to randomly mix. So if you can't tell right away, I think you can. I'm going to show you close up. You can absolutely see that that's not pure white anymore. I love the softness of that. You're even going to be able to see that on the brayer. Let's actually go to this. And let's brayer this off. This is not going to look white. It's going to have that shade of all the other colors mixing in. All right, so I have this now. I do need this to dry. So if you're using paint that isn't going to dry as fast as the paint that I'm using, you might need to wait a step. One thing I do want to tell you is that you see a little bit of what's happening there. It's really hard to see, but because of the dye spray, some of the paint layer is resisting. So again, really hard to see, but if you look right there, those are little sort of spots. And that spot where the paint is resisting sticking to the gel plate because of the wet dye spray. And I love that because that's going to give these very soft punctuated spots that you're going to see in your pole. It's going to give you the randomness that is just so beautiful in mixed media. All right, let's move along. So I am going to get a stencil. And I have this layer now. Remember, there was some loose dye spray, one layer of paint. Now I'm going to lay the stencil out, and I am going to spray through the stencil. So I'm going to do, again, sort of multiple colors. You could do it evenly, unevenly, however you like. You do not need to spray much. So I did one spritz. We can just lift it up and you can see it went right through. So don't overspray. You can if you want like a pooly mess, and that's really cool. But if you want the stencil design, don't overspray. One spray. All right, so I'm going to do two things. I am going to lift that stencil up, and I'm going to use all that deliciousness that's the wet ink on the top of the stencil, and I'm going to lay it over one of the pulls I made earlier. And I'm just going to use my hand. I could use a brayer just to burnish it down. So I'm going to get the negative of the stencil. Now I just want you to notice one thing. Do you see that sort of, I call it coraling, where it sort of pools? I, for one, don't care for that. That's also part of the reason why I then take my brayer and I brayer it out, because it takes away that pooling and it softens it up, and it gives you what for me is a more preferred look. And I still got this. So let's do two things here. Let's get some paper, and now I'm going to use some scrapbook paper. This is just commercial scrapbook paper. I like to pull prints on scrapbook paper. I have so much of it, and this allows me to build my own layers over it, but to get the benefit of what's there already. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just pulling the print from the wet ink. The ink sprays will stay wet for quite a long time. I'm going to pull that up, and I've got that, which is just a nice start. And then of course I got that. So I'm going to pull a quick print. Also using the heavy cream. Clean the plate by doing this, and then we're going to move on to ink pads. All right, I got this. Let's just move it up. Let's see what we get here. All right, the reveal. All right, we actually have some interesting effects here because we have some built effects that have built over time. So I don't know if you can see it. It may not be so obvious, but this area right here, this was actually where that mask, circle mask was. So I actually have a little bit of a circle edge. Very hard to see, but you can kind of see it's a different shade right there. And then I have a little bits of the dye spray stencil. I have the black coming through. I have a really good start. I also still have this stencil that's still wet. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it right over. And I'm just going to get as much as I can off. I don't want to waste any of this. This last bit of stuff is often just the best. Yeah, if you don't get that much, you still get something. All right, we are moving from dye sprays way quicker than my personal preference, but we need to move on. We're going to move on to ink pads. I'm just going to show you a couple different ways to use ink pads with the plate. And the first pads we're going to use are the dye-based ink pads. And for me, just my go-to tends to be the Distressing palette from Tim Holtz, but any dye ink will work for what I'm going to show you now. And we're going to do this a couple ways, but I'm going to do it a couple ways simultaneously. All right, I am going to have some light paper. When I say light, I don't necessarily mean in weight, I mean in color. I want a light background. So again, I'm using some scrapbook paper that has a bit of design on it. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to take the ink pad, and I will tell you that unfortunately mine are a little dry. These techniques tend to work better when they're fresh. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to literally just go direct to the gel plate. I'm going to give a good amount of pressure because mine are pretty dry. I'm just going to add that square of that one color in a bunch of different places. I did not choose these colors because I thought they went together. I chose these because they were the wettest of what I had. So we'll see what I get. Now, you may overlap. Remember, if you overlap, it means you're getting one color ink on another one of your ink pads. For me, that is great. For some people, that is code blue. So if you're that person, please keep your squares apart. All right, so I'm making kind of a patchwork. Now, I could go ahead and just pull the print right now. And in fact, I think I'll do that just so I can more clearly show you the very basic. And then I'll show you in the next layer a couple techniques. So I'm going to pull that, and I got that, which I think is pretty cool. And again, because it's dye ink, there's some translucency. You're going to get some color shift. So that blue is over that orange, so you're getting a little bit of green. And if I had placed it or chosen colors more particularly, I could have had a whole different pattern. It's just fun. I will tell you though that dye ink does fade. So you're gonna find that the piece that you've just made will fade a little bit. It won't be as vivid as you see it. Now I still have a little bit left on there, but I'm okay with that. What I am gonna do is I'm just gonna go back in and I'm gonna repeat what I just did so I can show you some other effects. I absolutely, I'm realizing I'm using blue and red. And so when you have blue and red, it's a color mixing, you're gonna get some purple. So I'm just gonna enhance that by specifically overlapping some blue and red. So I get that effect. I don't have to cover the whole plate. I'm just covering a lot of it. Now I can do a bunch of things now. I could get a little bit of spray, water, and heavily or softly spritz it because it's dye ink. It's going to move. It's going to blend. I am going to do it very softly for this. So I'm going to hold it up really high. I'm going to only aim for part of the plate. Maybe I'll hit it twice. And that's all I want to do. It's just going to move it around. And then I'm going to get some stamps, some rubber stamps. I'm going to do some debossing, some subtractive technique. I'm just going to go ahead and take that stamp and I'm going to press it into the wet or even the not wet ink. Doesn't matter. Either one, it's going to pull out the design. And then it's also going to have it now on the stamp. So when I move it and use it again, it's going to kind of be moving it around. The color, it's going to pull out. And now I'm going to go ahead. I got that stamp. It's got a little bit of dye ink on it. So let's not waste that. Let's just use that. I'm putting it on one of my collage pieces. Love it. It's making me really happy, guys. So I got that I'm building up now. And I'm going to get, again, something with a very light background. If I can find that. Pretty light background. And I'm going to pull that print. All right. Let's see what we got. We got that. I just think it's fun. And again, I got some purple in there, which I really, really like. There's some good purple there. And this was just really haphazard. Again, if I had, well, maybe if I overthought it I would even be less happy. So I'm good with that. And I got that dye ink on here. So remember what we did before when we used the dye spray. I went ahead over this with a bit of a stencil or with just a layer of white paint, and I pulled another print. So remember, you can do that. I'm going to move on because we got to move on, but I would definitely play more with all the ink that's still left there. All right, so you keep playing. Remember, you can always pause this and come back. And if you're in the middle of it, that's what I'd recommend. When you're done with this particular technique, come back and you'll be able to go with what we're going to do next, which is also ink pads, but it is with permanent ink pads. So I'm using StazOn, but there are a number of different sort of permanent solvent ink pads. I will remind you that I said earlier that both dye ink and some of the solvent ink can potentially stain your plate. I'm good with that. It doesn't affect the function, but if that's a concern, you should have one plate that's for the big mess that may never disappear. All right, I'm going to use these differently. Just again to show you a different technique, and I'm just going to use these on a stamp. So let's go ahead. I'm going to use this stamp. It's got a pretty strong pattern to it. I'm going to use a couple stamps. I think I'll use that one, and I think I'll use that one kind of together. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to use two different colors of permanent ink. And I think I'm going to do it without mounting it. So it's a little inconsistent. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to ink the stamp. My StazOns are also a little bit dried out. And I'm going to put that directly on the plate. And I'm going to move the stamp around. So I'm kind of creating and recreating a pattern. If I want more ink, I can just go back to the pad and add more ink so that I can create something a little bit more strong, because a lot of times it doesn't pull as strongly as you might think. And then I'm going to go in with another color. I'm using sort of, this is called rusty brown, but it's sort of orangey. So I'm using oranges and blues together. They work real well together. They're across from each other on the color wheel. And I'm going to go ahead and ink the stamp. And I'm going to add this in some spots. And I want you to notice I'm purposely leaving a gap. That's just sort of a design idea that I've decided on, that I don't want to have this on everything. I want an area that I can maybe use when I work over it for a focal point. All right, so I've done that. Now, StazOn dries quite fast, quite quickly. So I can go ahead and not really worry about waiting too long. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to, just for quickness and ease, I'm just going to choose one color paint. This is sort of a soft icy blue. And I'm going to just do one brayer roll and I'm going to pull up a print. What I find, interestingly enough, with this technique is that you can get several prints after you have the first layer and you pull it. There's still going to be some StazOn on there and you can continue going. I also want you to notice, if you can see, that because I still had some dye ink on the plate, that's being pulled up as well. All right, I don't want to waste this. In fact, let's break this up too a little bit. All right, so now I'm going to pull this. Let's see what we get. In theory, we should get that. I find it's most of the time you don't get the full pull. You know, there'll be a little bit that's left on the plate, unless you really wait for it to dry and burnish over time. All right, let's see what happens now. We got a pretty good full pull. And now I got that. And yes, I could have just inked over a painted background, but I promise you it will look very different. So that's a technique just to remember that you can use ink pads and stamps directly on the plate. All right, so we are going to move quickly to just a last quick little demo, which is watercolor, just so that you see that despite the fact that sometimes you read, you know, watercolor is not great because it beads up, all of that, it just means it's a very different effect. So my watercolor, I just use Peerless, which is a brand of watercolor that's just on these paper sheets. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use a water brush. I know this was not on the supply list, so if you don't have watercolors, you know, just watch and see what you think. You can always press pause and grab them as well. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to pull up, I'm going to engage the water brush so it gets wet. I'm going to pull up and I am just going to literally just sort of somewhat randomly paint it onto the sheet. You can see it doesn't act at all like acrylics. It completely beads up. And the plate almost acts as a resist. Now I've wet this quite a lot. I'm going to add a little bit more water just to this. And because I'm using this kind of paper, I also have the luxury that you wouldn't have if you were using, a little pot, I'm going to just lay it on and burnish it. And I'm going to pull it up and I've got some watercolor there as well. It's just going to be a different effect. It's hard to see. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just kind of clean my water brush by squeezing out some of the water, and I'm going to get even stronger spots. So let's just see what that looks like. I'm going to go on this that I've been working on, and I am going to do two things. I'm just going to lay it down and burnish it. I'm going to have my brayer ready, although the water may absorb pretty quickly. Yeah, it's probably absorbed already. And you see what I have here. For me, I don't really love that. For this, I really, really, really love that spot. So knowing what I did and what it led to, if I use this enough, I will be prepared to do what I need to do for whatever technique I want. Now there's still some watercolor on here. So what am I going to do? I'm going to get my water spritzer and I'm just going to hit it a little bit. And I'm going to reactivate the watercolor. And let's now just do it on this and see what we get. And I will remember that if I do not clean my plate now, when I add my next layer of paint, say, it's going to suck in that watercolor as well. Yeah, it's harder to see because it's not on a white background, but it definitely changed the look. All right, so quick review. And as I review, I'm going to just throw down all of these things that somehow I managed to make. No particular order. We started today with acrylics, and we worked our way through a number of different techniques with the acrylics, including using stencils. I am loving some of these, people. I am telling you. Some of them are keepers. Some of them aren't. That's okay, because one more layer and you get magic. I also then shifted over to dye ink sprays. And then we went to our ink pads. And then we used, really quickly, the watercolor. So what I would love to happen now, decide what you want to do in what order on what substrate. I also, although I didn't use them yet, brought some vintage book pages. I bought some tissue paper. I bought some deli paper, and I brought some fabric to use. So while you're working, I'm going to be working, and I'm probably going to use some of the substrates that I didn't use before. You're welcome to peek up every so often. I am going to alternately remain very quiet and alternately say something if I think there might be something I'm doing that would be helpful for you to know. And then we'll see where we go from there. All right, so let's pretend there's some music going on in the background, and maybe for some of you there is. And everybody create. I'm working on a vintage book page, and I'm using both dye sprays and with a stencil and paint just to create a very basic design in the background. I'm also using anything I have by me when I have a wet stencil or a brayer, just to continue to build. My goal now is to add some translucent paints to the gel plate so that I don't lose all this amazing writing on these old vintage book pages. Dye sprays would work well also because they're translucent. Sometimes I'll also just kiss the surface. So I'll take a portion of my substrate and just touch it down and do a quick burnish and then lift. So I get only segments of the paper with that color. And then I also leave segments of that color on the gel plate. So as I then add more layers, it's become more and more random and organic. And my layers, again, I could stick with paint, or I could alternate between paint and dye spray or watercolor or anything like that. think most people as they work tend to default to the additive techniques where you add layers. Just want to remind you that we spent a lot of time talking also about the negative subtractive techniques where you pull away using a stamp or something textured, a stencil. It's a completely different effect and equally valid in mixed media to build up as well as pull away. And I think most of the work that I tend to like the best that I've done have that combination of both additive and subtractive techniques. You can also kind of do both at the same time. So I just pulled off a layer with this stencil. With a baby wipe, I am going to go in before I pull the stencil, and I'm going to just spritz softly some ink from the dye spray, and just to do a little subtractive and then a little bit of additive, but really softly. Maybe just in a few little sections. Gonna leave that on my plate. A reminder to you never to leave anything untouched. So I have a wet stencil. So I am absolutely going to pull up from that wet stencil onto another piece I'm working on. Yeah. Somewhat subtle because it's translucent, but it adds some detail and some beauty. Come back to this baby. Liking the looks of that. I think I'm going to add a layer and then pull that full print. Keep in mind also, as we talked about, how the different materials may mix and blend. So be aware. Acrylic paint over dye ink will definitely leach up the color of the dye ink underneath. That can either be the most amazing thing or something that becomes a problem. Either way, when you get your next layer, you will figure out what to do with it. That's the nature of mixed media. I'm going to actually use some fabric to pull up this particular print, and we will see what happens with that. Let it dry too long. So I think when I pull this up, you're going to barely get it on here. There's just a soft touch. So I am going to go in again with another layer and be much more quick with the pull. So, and then I'm going to let it sit. Wasting no time while it's sitting, working on other things. And time to pull this up. See what we got. All right, so that partially covered some of the colors underneath, partially let them go through. It lightened up the fabric and kind of made it a little more cohesive. So when I add more detail now, it will really show up. I like that. And I still got that beauty right there. So don't be afraid of covering. Liking a layer does not necessarily mean that that layer is the final layer. So always remember that it's worth taking the risk to add one more layer. And if that one more layer doesn't bring you to where you want to go, it's yet another layer. We create mixed media art with a history, with the details that disappear and come through and reappear. And the more history we have in our piece, the more dimension, the more detail, the more meaning it is. So this is a good example. This one started out as the one that had lots of squares on it from the distress ink pads. And you can still see some of the lines from the linear squares, but the colors have been pushed back and muted. So now I have a really beautiful organic background. It's a combination between sort of loose and free and linear that I can build over now. We are going to be winding down in just a few moments. Of course, just because the time runs out for the class doesn't mean the time runs out for jelly printing. So I encourage you all, if you have the time, to keep going, keep playing, keep layering. If you don't have the time, just put everything that you made after you finish admiring it into a pile that you'll revisit when you can. And remember, if you ever get stuck, if you ever get to a place where you feel that you do not have that mojo, the jelly plate is something that can truly kick you into high gear. Just squeeze some paint, spray some spray, get some inexpensive copy paper, printer paper, and just pull print after print after print. You're going to pull one thing that all of a sudden inspires and motivates you. It usually is a foolproof way to get back onto creating. I'm doing one more walkthrough of the messes I made today. Some of them I love. Some of them I think are great starts. Some of them will absolutely get torn up because when I make something even 6 by 6 inches, if I tear it up into smaller pieces, I find that something I don't like all of a sudden becomes truly magical. So remember that. All right, my friends, we are wound down. I want to thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you all somewhere soon.